Well, this property was part of what was known as the Klingemann tract. It was owned by the Klingemann family from probably about the late 1800s. And then in the early 1900s, Fritz Klingemann volunteered to sell it to the city for about $2,000 because at the time, the City of New Braunfels pulled their water from the Comal River over by Landa Park. And due to the textile mills that are along the river, it was getting kind of polluted and they needed a cleaner water source. But at the time, they felt the asking price was too high, and so they held off, and eventually they decided they needed to do it anyway. So around 1907, they purchased it from Klingemann for $2,500 and installed some rudimentary water pumps and pipes and things, and it became basically the city's water supply. Then in the 1930s, the city took advantage of the federal government's New Deal programs in order to clean up the site because it had become kind of overgrown and such. And what they did, among other things, was they fully enclosed the spring with what's called the spring cap. It had been lined with stone and brick and such beforehand to kind of help enclose it, but they totally sealed it in concrete to help protect it from overflow and from debris and such. They built the stone buildings that are currently there, the water pressurization building and what was at the time a maintenance shop and a metal shop. And they built 2 wells, followed by a 3rd well in 1944. The federal government leased some of the land out here and built fish holding ponds. This was the so-called fish hatchery. And those were completed around 1936. And from 1936 until about 1959, those were used for holding young fish before they were introduced into the Comal River. So from the 1930s all the way to 1959, the New Braunfels Waterworks basically controlled this property and used it as the city's water source. In the 1950s, the New Braunfels Electric Company began taking over the utilities of the city, and they also took over the water and sewer works. And at that time, that's when they became essentially New Braunfels Utilities. And they took over this property around 1959, 1960, and have held it ever since. And in the late 60s is when they moved most of their operations here. And during that time is when they started building all the metal buildings and such that are on the property still and will be used. There used to be a caretaker's house built in about 1930 or so out in front. And the caretaker was the one who would basically keep an eye on all the water pumps and everything and the fish pond and such. And that house, unfortunately, was destroyed in a massive flood that came through here on May 11th, 1972, which completely picked up and moved the caretaker's house, stranded several of the workers on the roof of one of the stone buildings. They had to be rescued and generally caused all sorts of chaos. So we evaluated the buildings that are on the property to see whether they were significant historically, either in a local or a state level of historic context. And what we learned looking at all the buildings out here is that most of the metal buildings that are here date to the 1970s, maybe a little 60s, a period of time when NBU was here. And the stone buildings, as well as the spring cap and some of the retaining walls and a little fountain that's not functioning that's out there, all dated to the 1930s, to the time when this was part of the New Braunfels Waterworks. And after evaluating the site as a whole, we decided that little core area of the stone buildings and the spring cap and walls and such was a historic district, essentially. And the Texas Historical Commission agreed with us. This was a National Register eligible historic district, representing a remnant basically of the city's history when it was the New Braunfels Waterworks. It was basically the city's water supply. The Texas Historical Commission recognizes that something that's historic isn't as valuable when it's hidden away, and that when people can see it and appreciate it, it becomes much more integral into our state's history. It's always exciting to see, our past history preserved and opened up to the public, because a lot of these things, this was a public utility. The public didn't get a chance to see this stuff back when it was open and functioning. It's been well preserved. They're stone buildings from the 1930s, and it's fun that the public will get a chance to see them and get to see the source of the springs and be able to look into the springs as well and see what it looked like beforehand.